They are amongst the greatest treasures known to humankind, revered and feared for centuries. But many of them have a dark history, their creators possessed of madness and misery, their finders and holders struck by illness, death and misfortune. Dare you discover the secrets of these cursed treasures? A curse upon a great historical treasure could come in many forms. But it always comes at a great cost to its creator, finder, or owner. We begin our hunt for cursed treasures in Staffordshire in England. The onset of a violent storm announced an archaeological find like no other.
In July 2009, an unemployed man made one of the most important archaeological finds in British history. Terry Herbert had bought a metal detector for £2.50 from a car boot sale and was using it to scan the fields around Lichfield in Staffordshire. What he found was the most extraordinary hoard of treasure, 4,600 items. This was an unprecedented haul. No one had ever found such extraordinary quantities of such important historical material.
But was the discovery of the Staffordshire hoard predicted in a legendary Anglo-Saxon saga written 1,300 years ago?
The story of Beowulf's really interesting because it's from this part of the country, but also it kind of encodes possible information about pieces that are found from the Staffordshire hoard, perhaps, where it talks about dragons protecting these great golden hoards that were buried. It talks about Beowulf dying trying to protect such hoards buried under the ground from dragons and other creatures. And it kind of really opens up this idea that there may be some truth in these ancient stories.
The hero of the poem, Beowulf, kills a dragon that had been guarding a hoard of buried treasure. And as the Staffordshire hoard was being found by the metal detectorist, the weather was unusually stormy, and so there could be a mythological link between the thunderstorm and a ghostly dragon trying to protect the hoard. This is highly imaginative, but high imagination is what makes archaeology often thrilling.
We have the whole story of when Terry Herbert first made the discovery. Great thunderstorms broke out at that exact moment, suggesting that land may have been protected by some kind of sorcery or a curse. So we have to question, was the Staffordshire hoard kind of connected to a curse?
When it was removed from the earth, much of the hoard had been deliberately damaged, vandalized almost. So items were twisted or bent. This was something which had plainly been done as some form of ritualized acknowledgement of a victory over an army's foes.
There's a scene in Beowulf where they defeat an enemy king and they strip off his armor and they take his sword, they take his helmet, and they take the blade back to their king, and they take the cap of the helmet back, and they take his chainmail. But it says that they left the gold in the ground. So is there a hint there in Beowulf of this practice of maybe deliberately burying those gold bits, those precious bits that make the enemy's sword his sword, and you can then reclaim the blade and use it for yourself. You know, is there a hint in Beowulf of why the hoard was buried?
There are two lines in Beowulf which have helped fuel a sort of popular belief that the hoard was cursed. And those lines talk about let the treasure be buried underneath the gravel and the earth, as useless to man as it ever was. And this has led to speculation that this was some form of ritual, a pacification or honouring of pagan gods, donating to these gods the spoils of war, the war that you had just won.
The discovery of the buried treasure would bring with it a new conflict over ownership and profit between Terry Herbert, the man who discovered it, and his friend, Fred Johnson, on whose land it was discovered.
The hoard was valued at £3.2 million. And when a Birmingham museum raised the money to buy it, the proceeds were divided equally between Terry Herbert and Fred Johnson. Each got approaching £1.7 million. That looks like extraordinary good fortune. And certainly it changed both of their lives. But it also tore them apart.
Fred Johnson is 65. He's farmed all his working life, inherited the place from his parents. He acquired the field where the hoard was found in 1983.
Some people have said, oh, you're going to have massive amounts of millions, 10, 20 back. Tell them not to talk so bloody daft, like, you know. But, it's still a fair amount of money what's coming, I suppose.
Initially, they cooperated very well, but as the profits grew astronomically larger and the media attention more and more pressured, the friendship split, it seems, for good.
When we were on the field, we agreed not to give any interviews, and it was a shock of my life to see him in the paper. He blew it wide open the first day.
And what did you make of that? What did you think?
I was a little bit put out.
For those who think curses are associated with buried treasure, there's a certain amount of mileage in the Staffordshire hoard. One aspect being the freak weather conditions, the terrific electric storms around the time of its finding, and the other is the breakdown of the friendship between the two people most involved in the find, who had been cooperating wonderfully. So if two marks of a curse are supernatural intervention and human misfortune, you have both in the same package.
I don't think we've seen any evidence of anything kind of supernatural around the hoard and a curse or anything like that. But it is funny because the Anglo-Saxons would be completely on board with the idea of a curse. They were very superstitious people. You know, they 100% believed in magic, and that, you know, curses and blessings and interventions from gods and spirits were around them every single day. And we see that in the hoard, and the symbols, you know, the animals that are inscribed or created into those pommel caps. The Anglo-Saxons believed that gave them powers, and they believed that they could use those powers against their enemies. So, you know, the fast-striking serpent, the strength of the boar, the sharp-beaked bird of prey, all of these are powerful animal symbols that decorate the objects of the hoard. And, you know, warriors were using these symbols to give themselves protection and to possibly help them, you know, destroy, defeat, ultimately kill enemy warriors.
Beware of Beowulf, all ye weekend metal detectorists, because you may indeed find more than you ever bargained for. We now travel to the Badkhshan mines in Afghanistan. They are famous for producing precious gems that take millions of years to form under the violent heat and pressure of the Earth's core. Is it possible that when they are wrenched from their resting place, that they carry with them the forces of nature that created them?
For more than 70 years, every British Parliament was opened ceremonially by the Queen, Queen Elizabeth II, and on every occasion the Queen wore the imperial state crown. And front and centre of the imperial state crown is the Black Prince ruby. It's a jewel with an incredibly dark and blood-soaked past. The Black Prince ruby has been steeped in blood for centuries. And it's a story of murder, of treachery, of deceit, of betrayal.
Precious gems are sought after and admired the world over, but the most valuable have long been associated with bringing ill fortune and death to those who own them. One such jewel is the Black Prince's ruby.
The Black Prince's ruby is a pear-shaped stone, a transparent, deep, slightly purplish red stone, about 4 centimetres long.
It's actually a very old Asiatic cut, and that is, there's no facets on it. It's a rounded mass that's been lightly polished. And if you look carefully at it, there's a tiny drill hole that goes right through the stone, and that harks back to an ancient history where it was often worn in a cord, round the neck, or in some item of clothing.
Although the British imperial state crown is adorned with almost 3,000 precious stones, the Black Prince's ruby stands out for its size and beauty.
The Black Prince ruby sits right in the middle of the current state crown, right in the perfect point, with the Cullinan II, a huge diamond, and the Stuart sapphire at the back and the St Edward's sapphire at the top. And it truly is the most magnificent regal ornament.
The Black Prince's ruby is one of these sort of iconic gemstones in the British Crown jewels. And it was Queen Elizabeth II's favourite gemstone.
The origin of the Black Prince's ruby has long been shrouded in mystery, although in recent years detailed geological analysis has shone new light upon it.
It is only recently, through science and investigation, that we now understand where this stone might have come from. These stones were known as balas at the time, found near Badkhshan, balas being named for Badkhshan in Afghanistan. And the mines there, the Kulilal mine, which is on the borders between Tajikistan, Afghanistan and China, produced these magnificent gems about 950 AD, hugely long time ago. And these gems were obviously mined and then bartered and traded along the Silk Road, ultimately finding their way through Europe and into many of the great royal collections where they were hugely revered.
It made its way across to Europe. And from that moment onward, it became almost the centerpiece of treachery, of murder plots, of deceit, of executions, of assassinations, of disease. And as a result, it acquired and continues to have the reputation of a stone which is cursed.
One of the legends about the Black Prince's ruby is that it came into the hands of the Spanish ruler called Pedro the Cruel, or Pedro the Just, and it came from a rather brutal murder of a Muslim ruler, Mohammed VI.
A lot of misfortune has befallen many of its owners. The Black Prince's ruby got its name because Prince Edward, who was known as the Black Prince, was a fearsome warrior in Europe. He helped Don Pedro fight a battle in Spain in 1367. And when they won the battle, the Black Prince demanded that Don Pedro hand over the ruby, which became known as the Black Prince ruby.
The Black Prince, Edward, took it back to England, but he too suffered misfortune. He began suffering from dysentery, violent bouts of dysentery. And he died in some agony before he could ever take the throne of England.
After his death, the gem was passed to his son, King Richard II, who was murdered.
It was worn by Charles I and Queen Mary of Scotland, and they died early through misfortune.
And subsequent regal owners fared little better. King James would lose the throne and end his life in exile.
All of this, from Pedro through James, has been woven into a tapestry of misfortune, and, according to popular myth, has embroidered this tapestry into a belief that the Black Prince Ruby carries a curse.
To determine how powerful the curse might be, we first have to ask how much of its history is real or imagined.
The Black Prince Ruby is itself an imposter. It's not a ruby. It's something called a spinel. Looks very similar, but slightly different construction. But what we know as the Black Prince Ruby isn't a ruby at all.
The Black Prince's Ruby was only called the Black Prince's Ruby in about 1760 by an English politician and art historian, Horace Walpole, who identified the stone as a possibility. There was this portrait of a young prince, supposedly the Black Prince, with a red stone, and he said it looked a bit like a painting of the stone in the crown jewels. I think the portrait wasn't of the Black Prince. I think it's probably a later portrait of somebody else. So before that, there was no connection. I think it started in the 18th century, this idea that there was a connection to the Black Prince.
We don't know the associations of the stones, whether the ruby we see today was ever owned by the Black Prince. What we do know, however, are some facts. We know that great spinels were found in Asia at the time and marketed through Europe. We know that many of the royal inventories have beautiful stones, these ballast rubies as they were known, in their collections. And there were certainly some collections that noted huge ballast rubies, one of which could have been the Black Prince ruby itself.
So we know that Pedro the Cruel came into the hands of some large spinels, and we know that he gave some things possibly to the Black Prince, but there's no way of actually tracing the stone now in the crown jewels back to those events. The Black Prince was the kind of a great hero. He was the epitome of chivalry. He became the kind of a hero of the time. And if there had been any connection of this stone in the crown jewels with him, this would have been mentioned before the late 18th century. We don't know when it came into royal hands in this country or where it came from. I think it's fair to assume it was the large spinel that was owned by Henry VIII, probably in Elizabeth I's crown, and then on since then, really. So it's been in a state crown of this country right back until to the 1500s.
All of this is a great tale. Let's face it, it's a great tale. Mysterious stones transported across Europe, blood, death, treachery, deceit. It's got all the makings of a historical bodice-ripping melodrama. It's a great tale. But is it a curse?
The idea that bad luck can be carried in objects, I think it relates to the notion that the essence of a person or a situation can somehow rub off on the object. When it comes to objects like the Black Prince's ruby, it's not too surprising that many of the people who've owned it historically will have met grisly ends, because if you're the kind of person who can own an object like that, you're clearly very rich and powerful, and rich and powerful people often have many, many enemies.
People do remember the really bad things that happen, like death and misfortune and bad luck, and the effects it has on many people, even the falling of great empires associated with the stones that persist. And I think that persistence, the bad travels with the stone through time, and through time those stories become convoluted, they may even become worse. And it's that we sometimes forget, that we should maybe not believe them, but think about how they've travelled through time and the famous lives that they pass through as well.
The only curse, really, of the Black Prince ruby, I think, is probably the fact that this myth or legend about its history has been taken as sort of gospel truth and is repeated ad infinitum in books, on the web, and so and so. And this is one of the things that historians really hate, is where sort of legend becomes truth without verification. And I think, to my mind, that's the hearse.
This imposter gemstone has blood in her being. Little wonder that uneasy lies the crown of all those deemed divine enough to wear the Black Prince's ruby. Our cursed treasure hunt next takes us to China, where an immortal army stood guard for 2,000 years. Discovered in 1974 in Shaanxi province, did the disturbance of this epic tomb unleash a curse?
The Terracotta Army is one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. It's a literal army of clay or earthenware figures, together with chariots and horses, all life-size, buried 200 years before the birth of Christ in a hillside in Shaanxi in China. It was designed to protect China's emperor, first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, after his death and on his journey to the afterlife.
Throughout history, there have been rulers who have used brutality to conquer and enslave. One such ruler was King Shi Huang, first emperor of China.
He's known as a very ruthless leader. People would be severely punished if they didn't follow his rules.
He is credited with creating a uniform measurement system, monetary system, creating a bureaucracy. But he did so through enormous levels of violence.
Through brutal conquest, the first emperor forced China to unite under his tyrannical rule. As his kingdom grew, so did his desire for immortality. But his extraordinary plan to make this a reality would be the source of mystery and misery from its conception right up until the present day. In death, as in life, the emperor surrounded himself with an army. 8,000 soldiers were constructed from terracotta to stand guard and protect him in the afterlife.
The Terracotta Army is a 2,200-year-old mausoleum, and I would say it's probably the most important find in the 20th century.
It is claimed as the 8th wonder of the world.
The Terracotta Army dutifully performed their task of protecting the emperor for 2,000 years. But then in 1974, two farmers digging a well made a fateful discovery.
They dug about 3 meters deep. They came upon bodies of the terracotta warrior, and including the head and shoulders.
It was an area which was known to have historic importance, and from time to time, people would find small artifacts.
This discovery got reported to members of the local museum, and so professional archaeologists came over to have the excavation. The Terracotta Army is the most important archaeology finds in the world.
Over the next 3 or 4 years, the whole site was explored. It was a source of enormous shock and surprise. But I don't think anyone really understood the vastness of what lay under the soil.
Over 8,000 life-size clay warriors were discovered. More than 700 clay horses and over 130 chariots were found after having been buried for more than 2 millennia.
This was almost like a battlefield. There's definitely different divisions and different ranks and hierarchies. It's like a real army.
It was assumed that there was some kind of template or mold that was being used to produce these warriors.
But their facial expressions, hairstyle, costume, all different, so they look unique and individual.
The This was a large-scale production that occurred over around 38 years. There were 700,000 workers. Each one created a unique piece to reflect a real living soldier at the time.
They were originally coloured. Of course, now much of that pigmentation has gone. There must have been an extraordinary sight to see these enormous horde of very, very lifelike statues.
What scientific excavation showed was that the statues, this army, 8,000 and some statues, was only a tiny part of what had been buried in the hillside. In fact, what was underneath those hills was an entire replica of the emperor's palace, 98 kilometers of it.
In terms of scale, in terms of historic importance, this is a unique place. So in that sense, of course, it's treasure.
Although it was clearly a symbol of the emperor's power, the original purpose of the army was not just a show of great wealth. His thinking was more far-reaching and disturbing.
The army was commissioned by the first emperor of China. Qin Shi Huang first came to the throne in 246 BC. He was only 13 years old at the time.
At that time, China was divided into 7 states that had been at war for a few centuries.
The first emperor conquered each of these different states.
He ruled with an iron fist, but it's part of this reason that he was actually so successful in uniting China.
The terracotta warriors were statues to protect his tomb. The first emperor believed that, he would literally go to another world and his entourage and his servants and everyone else would be there with him to carry on.
He was buried with concubines, hundreds of concubines, and this was purely for the emperor's pleasure in the afterlife. As well as that, all the artisans, the people that worked on the mausoleum, they were actually sealed inside the tomb with him.
He was clearly a complete megalomaniac, and it may be that these were alive. We don't know, but it's possible that his retainers, his closest kind of associates, were all buried with him when he died. It's just an enormous vanity project.
Qin Shi Huang's death should have meant the end of his reign of terror. But did his legacy live on in the form of a curse upon those who discovered his tomb 2,000 years later?
The terracotta army has pretty much all the elements you would want to invest the idea, the belief in a mystical curse or a supernatural visitation of misfortune. For a start, it's ancient. It's 200 years before Christ. It's from a little understood, even today, culture and civilization, and it's to do with death.
Qin Shi Huang ruled China with an iron fist, but for all his strength, he had one frailty that ruled him.
He was actually terrified of death, and this is precisely recorded in historical documents at the time. He spent many, many years searching for the elixir of immortality, and he sent key advisors and key scientific medical practitioners on missions to try to find the elixir of immortality. In the end, he was given a pill filled with mercury, which was believed by them at the time to create endless life. And it's quite ironic that it was his search for life which ended up resulting in his death.
Qin Shi Huang made building his kingdom and carefully preparing his mausoleum his life's work. Yet only a few years after his death, his entire empire was in peril.
The terracotta warrior site is so vast that it must have contributed to the ultimate demise of the regime that he led because of the enormous resources that were put into this site.
The region where the terracotta army lay entombed is steeped in superstition. Back in 1974, many of the locals feared the disturbance of such a sacred site would rain misery upon them.
From the moment the terracotta warriors were unburied and unearthed, the villagers were worried about what this would create for them in their lives.
You were messing with the gods of the ancient world, and they shouldn't be moved, they shouldn't be disturbed in any way.
It was believed that by unearthing these statues, it was disturbing positive feng shui and it was going to bring misfortune.
So did a curse really descend upon the land? And if so, how?
There really is something otherworldly about this whole site. The fact that this terracotta army were buried, and I believe they were supposed to stay buried.
Now, many of the farmers who were directly involved in unearthing the terracotta army did seem to experience great misfortune afterwards.
3 of the original 7 that existed there at the time of the discovery dying in terrible circumstances.
One of them committed suicide, he hanged himself, and the 2 others died in poverty and ill health. Out of the 4 remaining farmers, they now survive on $2 a day, selling souvenirs outside the mausoleum of the Emperor's tomb. One logical explanation for the curse is really related to government greed. Most of the people in the village were already very poor. Now, once the discovery was made, the government moved in. They needed to clear area for tourist buildings.
They were building the visitor centre with cement works being created, with the farmers being moved off their site, with crops failing because of the pollution that all this building was causing. It really raised a lot of issues with the local populace who were, mostly superstitious.
China's development has come at colossal cost to many people over the last 40 or 50 years, and they can attribute that to many, many things, including the curse of finding, an important site like this.
But the curse of the terracotta army also has a scientific explanation, one that quite literally courses through the veins of the Emperor's hidden city.
The representation of his earthly palace had rivers of literal mercury in it, and a lot of that deadly poisonous metal still remains in the soil. Put all this together, wrap it all up, give it a stir in the pot, and you have all the ingredients for a modern myth of an ancient curse.
Until this date, the tomb of the Emperor still has not been opened. It's an enormous complex. It's believed to be absolutely filled with treasures that would probably put Tutankhamun's tomb into insignificance. But they haven't opened it yet because it's historically recorded that it's filled with booby traps. So they've got crossbows rigged throughout the various passageways. There are also rivers of mercury throughout the tomb. Scientific testing has actually validated it. They have found very high traces of mercury. The second reason they haven't opened the tomb is concern for the preservation. So it's on such an enormous scale that the moment the tomb is opened and oxygen enters the tomb, it's going to cause immediate deterioration of all of the items, and especially the body of the Emperor inside.
The millions of tourists who file past the army in years to come may give cause to remember not just their spectacle, but the eternal curse bestowed upon them by Emperor Qing Shi Huang. Could he bestow it upon you too? We now travel to Egypt, where the sculpture of a legendary beauty is said to bewitch and damn all those who look upon her.
Almost 3,400 years ago, a sculptor employed by the pharaoh Akhenaten packed up his tools and shuttered his workshop. And he left behind a collection of half-finished objects, and one of those was of Akhenaten's queen, his consort, his fellow ruler. Nefertiti. Because she's ancient, because she is so exquisitely beautiful, and because she is bound up with the whole Egyptology cult, there is this persistent folk myth, almost, that the bust of Nefertiti is cursed.
The bust of Nefertiti is perhaps one of the most striking images we have from the whole ancient Egyptian artistic canon. It was discovered by a German-led team in 1912 at the site of Tel El Amarna, the capital city of King Akhenaten, who was Nefertiti's husband.
Now the bust is a piece of solid limestone that's been expertly sculpted. It's a human female face with this tall blue crown. The stone was then covered in a gesso, a plaster, and this was then painted, very lifelike colours. Superb shading. I think one of the strengths of the bust is the way that the artists have used the colours on the skin, on the makeup, the details of the crown and the broad collar necklace. So it is a stunning work of art in its own right.
She has no hair, she just has that very strange angular crown. And so she looks like any kind of character in, modern science fiction, popular fiction. She speaks to so many different audiences by appearing so contemporary.
The name Nefertiti means the beautiful one has come. So the idea of Nefertiti being a very beautiful individual is encoded in her name, if you like.
But could Nefertiti's very beauty have been a curse in itself?
I think it's fair to say that the sheer beauty of the bust of Nefertiti has completely blinded the whole world to the actual woman herself. It's as if we can't see beyond how beautiful she is. We can't acknowledge that she achieved what she did in her life. This is a woman who had 6 children, who co-ruled with her husband, who some of us believe ruled after him as a female pharaoh. There are images of her wielding a scimitar-like sword to kill her enemies. This woman was dynamic, she was active, she was powerful, but she'll always simply be dismissed as beautiful because of this bust.
The bust was discovered by a German archaeological mission working at the site of Tel El Amarna, which is the location of Nefertiti and her husband Akhenaten's capital city, Akhet-Aten.
German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt discovered it, and as a result of that, the Egyptian government at the time allowed some objects, including the bust, to leave Egypt to be exported, and that's why it is now on display in Berlin.
It was put on display in a museum in Berlin, and it caused an instant sensation, not just a sensation in Germany. The bust of Nefertiti became internationally famous. It drew visitors to Germany from all across Europe and beyond.
Her beauty even cast a spell over the most evil man of the modern age.
Now, one of the people that's been famously mesmerised by this iconic bust was none other than Adolf Hitler, who absolutely loved it so much. And during his time in power in Germany, he's said to have been completely mesmerised by this beautiful face that he considered an icon of Aryan beauty.
That fame, that international celebrity, also attracted the attention of the Egyptian government. It realised that this priceless artifact had somehow slipped through its fingers and had been taken out of Egypt and to the West. And it began petitioning German governments to have it returned.
The circumstances in which the bust of Nefertiti was allowed to leave Egypt are a little bit murky.
The German archaeologists may or may not have sort of presented the find to the authorities in Cairo Museum at that time.
This dispute, this legal wrangling, dragged on for a decade until finally a deal was reached by which the German government would return Nefertiti to Egypt in return for a collection of lesser antiquities. The transfer never took place, and it didn't take place because Adolf Hitler had other ideas. He adamantly refused to let Nefertiti go home. Why? I suspect the reality is Hitler had an extraordinary belief that somehow, somewhere in Egypt, lay the keys to protecting the new Third Reich that they were creating. And Hitler dispatched teams of archaeologists to search for these mystical solutions, these mystical protections that could be bestowed by the ancient Egyptian pharaohs on the Third Reich.
As the power of the Third Reich grew, Nefertiti continued to assume great importance to Hitler. But could he have been enamored with an impostor?
It's always described as the bust of Nefertiti, and yet there is no name on it, it is uninscribed. But Egyptologists have always assumed it to be Nefertiti because there are other representations of her wearing her characteristic tall blue crown of exactly the same type that the bust wears, and so we always call this the bust of Nefertiti.
There is nothing like it, and that has led to some speculation. That and the fact that it is such a modern-looking image of an ancient individual, that's led to suggestions that it might not even be genuinely ancient, and that in fact it might have been produced by the German excavators who brought about the sensational discovery of a very beautiful piece by making it themselves.
Some have raised questions because of the sheer brilliance, the sheer unusual nature of the preservation of the colours and the plaster. People have naturally perhaps wondered about the authenticity of the piece.
I personally believe it was found in 1912. The excavation photographs show the bust in context with the German archaeologists. But I think they did themselves no favours when it was somehow spirited out of Egypt, because that's only fed the flames of controversy. It's like, where did it really come from? Why did it end up in Germany? Lots of unanswered questions.
The ongoing dispute over her provenance continues to cast a dark shadow and bring conflict to all those who wish to possess her, leading some to believe that only when she is returned to her rightful home will the curse be lifted.
The Egyptian government has consistently pressured the German government to send Nefertiti home, to return her where she belongs. The German government has equally consistently refused. In 2005, the Egyptians even petitioned UNESCO to try and release Nefertiti from what they viewed as her captivity. All to no avail. Today, she remains where she was taken more than 100 years ago.